the chamber that was never built for us. The vote was already decided before the first word was spoken. Everyone in that chamber knew it. The delegates knew it. The security staff standing at the curved doorways knew it. Even the automated translation systems seemed to know it, cycling through their 51 language protocols with the mechanical patience of something that had processed 1,000 verdicts just like this one. Ambassador Kael Maren of Earth knew it too. He had known it for 6 days, since the first encrypted briefing landed in his personal log, and he had read it twice, slowly, the way a person reads something they are hoping will change meaning on the second pass. It had not changed. The resolution was going to pass. The only question was whether he would stand up and make them say it to his face, or whether he would let it happen quietly, the way the Council preferred its difficult moments, smoothly, like without friction, like something natural. Kael had decided he would not make it easy for them. The chamber was called the Resonance Hall. It sat inside a deep space installation called Virith Anchor, a structure so old that the species who had built it no longer existed as a distinct civilization. They had merged with the Cirith continuance 4,000 years ago, and their original language survived only in the architectural carvings on the outer hall. The room itself was vast. It curved upward in concentric tiers, each level filled with the delegates and observers of 49 recognized species, their bodies shaped by completely different evolutionary pressures, their atmospheres maintained by a system of micro-environmental fields so precise that a Delvari delegate breathing nitrogen methane and a Korith delegate breathing oxygen could sit 3 seats apart without either one dying. Everything about the room had been designed by committee over millennia. Every angle, every material, every lighting frequency had been negotiated, adjusted, and renegotiated. The temperature was set to favor the Cirith. The gravity was calibrated for the Telvine. The acoustic dampening was tuned to the hearing range of the Oroki, which meant that humans, whose hearing extended slightly beyond it, caught faint background harmonics that gave them low-grade headaches after 3 hours inside. Kael had learned that on his second day, 7 years ago. He had been taking headache tablets every session since. He had never mentioned it to anyone. Counselor Veth Aran of the Cirith Continuance was speaking. She was ancient, even by Cirith standards, and she moved with the particular slowness of something that had existed long enough to stop being in a hurry. Her voice, processed through the translation field into something Kael's ears could decode, arrived as a low, layered sound, like 2 voices speaking slightly out of sync with each other. She was listing human violations of the Maren Compact. The irony of that name was not lost on Kael, and I suspect it was not lost on her either, though the Cirith had never shown much interest in irony. She spoke for 37 minutes. 3 other species followed: the Delvari, the old Oroki Federation, a species called the Veth Psi that had only joined the Council 60 years ago and is, as far as Kael could tell, deeply invested in demonstrating their reliability to their longer-established neighbors by agreeing with everything. They all said the same thing in the end. Humanity was accelerating too fast. Humanity had pushed into boundary zones. Humanity had built weapons systems that violated the Compact's restrictions on strategic modeling technology. Humanity was not ready. Humanity was dangerous. Kael had heard versions of this speech many times. What was different today was the resolution attached to it. When the floor opened, he stood. He spoke for 9 minutes. He did not raise his voice.
He had learned in 7 years that raising your voice in a room full of species who communicated through frequency modulation, bioluminescence, and chemical signals was mostly a human habit that read as distress rather than emphasis. He spoke clearly, and he made one argument, the same argument from 9 different angles. There was a colony ship. Its name was the Ardent Shore. It was registered civilian, carrying 6,412 people, families, technicians, agricultural specialists, teachers, children, who had signed 12-year relocation contracts to the Vendra settlements. The Ardent Shore is currently in transit through the Kelm Corridor. The resolution, as written, would reclassify it as an unlawful vessel the moment it crossed the boundary marker in approximately 18 hours. The enforcement clauses allowed Council fleets to interdict any non-compliant human vessel. Interdict is a legal word that everyone in the room understood the weight of. He asked for 48 hours, just 48 hours for the ship to redirect. Counselor Veth Aran said the resolution was complete. He asked for a formal amendment, 3 words. He had already written them out. The floor was closed. The vote was 46 in favor, 1 against. Kael's hand, raised alone in a chamber of 49 species, stayed up for 4 seconds after the count was read. He did not know exactly why. Some instinct, old and stubborn, to make the record honest. Then he lowered it, and he opened his personal log, and he wrote a single line.
6,412 people on the Ardent Shore. The Council just made them a problem to be solved. His communications aide, a young woman named Petra Sol, came to stand beside him as the chamber emptied. She was 28, sharp and composed under pressure. Her face, right now, was the color of cooling metal. She placed her hand near his, not touching, just near. It was the most human thing that had happened in the room all day. Kael's translation ship signaled an incoming priority channel from Earth Command. He pressed the receiver and listened. The voice belonged to Admiral Una Dresch, commanding officer of Earth's Forward Strategic Fleet. She spoke in the quiet, controlled tone of someone holding something enormous very still inside themselves. She said, "Kael, the Ardent Shore has gone dark. Cyrath enforcement vessels were confirmed in the Kelm Corridor 21 minutes ago. We have no telemetry." He said, "When did the vote conclude?" She said, 26 minutes ago. 5 minutes. They had waited 5 minutes after the vote before moving. Kael sat very still, and he thought about 6,412 people who had been eating, sleeping, watching their children, trusting in the laws of civilized space to hold. Then he stood. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his case. Petra asked what they were going to do. He looked at the chamber one last time, the ancient carvings, the tiered seating, the perfect environmental engineering of a room built for everyone except them, and he said, "Send the full session record to Earth Command, Priority 1 encryption, everything, my personal log included. Send it before anything else." She said, "And then?" "Then," he said, "we wait, because there is nothing left for us to do here." What he did not tell her, because he did not yet have the words for it, was the feeling that had settled into his chest the moment Admiral Dresch had spoken. It was not grief, though grief was there. It was not anger, though that was there too. It was something colder
and much quieter. Something that felt like a door, deep inside him, closing very gently, with no sound at all. Humanity had followed every rule. He had raised his hand and spoken clearly and asked politely, and still 6,412 people had been taken from the stars. He walked out of the resonance hall, and he did not look back. Somewhere on the other side of human space, he knew, people who had been planning for exactly this moment for a very long time were already awake. Commander Reva Stahl received the news 11 hours and 4 minutes after it happened. She was in the forward observation bay of the UEHF Constant Meridian, a heavy carrier sitting at the edge of the Delvari monitoring zone, close enough to a Council sensor buoy that her crew ran passive-only sensors as a matter of standard practice. She had been awake for 19 hours. She had not been waiting for sleep. She had been waiting for this. Her communications officer, a man named Tav Osei, knocked twice and entered without waiting. That told her everything she needed to know before he handed her the physical tablet, the kind they used for transmissions too sensitive to the ship's network. She read it once, then again. Colony vessel Ardent Shore, registry designation 9 Vendra 12, lost contact at 0347 station time. Last confirmed position, Keln Corridor, grid reference 44 Foxtrot. Cyrath Enforcement Squadron confirmed in sector. No distress signal. No survivors confirmed. Recovery operations not authorized under current Council mandate. 6,412 people. She put the tablet face down on the console and stood very still for a while. Then she said, "Seal the communications room. Nothing out until I authorize it." Tav said, "Yes, sir," and left.
She sat alone for 14 minutes. She has never told anyone what she thought about during those 14 minutes, only that there was a moment, very short, very quiet, that felt like a door somewhere deep inside her, closing gently and finally. After that, the thinking was very clear, clean and cold, the way thinking gets when everything unnecessary has been cut away. At 0900 station time, the Earth Emergency Council convened via secured relay. Reva was among 16 fleet commanders patched into the session. There were no speeches. She wants to be precise about that, because people imagine these moments as dramatic, raised voices, declarations, someone striking a table. It was not like that. It was 43 minutes of quiet, methodical review. Numbers were checked, legal frameworks were examined, referenced, and set aside. At the end, Director General Soma Ade spoke for 86 seconds. She said that the Council had violated its own founding charter by ordering a lethal enforcement action against a non-military civilian vessel without warning, due process, or the unanimous approval required by its own internal statutes. She said that Earth's Sovereign Defense Compact, this constituted grounds for a formal response. She said that Earth was not declaring war, because declaring war would blunt the Council the standing of an equal combatant, and the Council had not earned that standing. What Earth was doing, she said, was exercising its legal and sovereign right to defend its people by any means it judged necessary. Then she said 2 words: Verity, activate. The channel closed. On the bridge of the Constant Meridian, nobody spoke for a moment.
Reva's first officer, a steady man named Bram Solos, who had served with her for 5 years and kept a folded photograph of his daughters tucked behind his identification panel, turned to her and said, "Is this actually happening?" She said, "Yes." He looked at the stars through the main viewport, then back at her. What does verity mean, actually mean, not the contingency designation? She told him. Contingency Verity had been built over 22 years by a team of 411 strategists, historians, engineers, and legal architects. It was not a battle plan. It was a complete operational doctrine built around a single foundational assumption. Earth will be outgunned, outnumbered, operating inside a legal and military environment designed by and for its opponents. Build the response that works in that world and no other. The team had done exactly that. Phase 1 had been running quietly for 13 years. Sensor networks seeded along disputed boundaries, data relay systems hidden inside commercial shipping infrastructure, structural surveys of every Council enforcement installation within 5 sectors of human space, behavioral modeling of Council fleet command patterns, all of it logged, cataloged, and indexed. Phase 2 was what they were entering now. In the planning documents, it had one name: the Silence. All non-essential transmissions from human vessels were to cease. Fleet movements were to read on Council sensors as compliance and retreat. Every ship was to appear as a vessel standing down. The quarantine was to look from the outside exactly like what the Council wanted it to be, a species that had accepted its containment. Reva gave the orders. Over the next 8 hours, the constant meridian became a ghost. Systems powered down in sequence, exterior signature reduced, engine output dropped to the floor of what Council long-range sensors would register as a vessel at minimal operational capacity. They were not hiding, they were performing. 61 human vessels in the sector were doing the same thing, each one following the same operational directive, all of it coordinated without a single transmission that the Council could intercept, because the timing had been pre-calculated and distributed before the quarantine sealed the communications corridors. The Council's enforcement fleet moved in with the confidence of people who had never lost a war they had started. They were large ships, Sirath and Delvari built, heavy weapons platforms designed for direct fleet engagements that the Council's military doctrine had codified over 9,000 years of what they called civilized conflict. They took up positions along the boundary corridors and sat in formation and watched human space go dark and still. Reva watched them on her sensor display. 38 warships. She knew exactly what their commanders were thinking. They were thinking humanity had given up. What they could not know, what no species in the galaxy could have understood without 4,000 years of human military history pressed into their memory, was that going quiet was not something humans did when they surrendered. Humans went quiet when they were deciding how to take something apart. There is a concept that appears in human military texts going back to antiquity: strategic patience, the discipline of waiting, not out of weakness, but out of precision. You wait until the angle is right. You wait until your opponent has committed fully to an assumption that is about to be proven catastrophically wrong. You wait until the moment you choose, not the moment your enemy forces on you.
Every fleet commander in human space had read those texts. Every one of them understood what the silence meant. Brahm appeared at her shoulder 18 hours in. The Council's forward ships were transmitting a mandatory compliance acknowledgement request to all human vessels in sector. She was supposed to confirm that the quarantine was being observed.
she said. "Send the compliance signal. Clean and prompt. Give them nothing to question." He looked at her. She said, "Send it." He sent it. The Council ships acknowledged and resumed their patrol patterns. They had no idea that while they watched human vessels sit dark in the void, 74 human engineering teams were already executing Phase 3. They had no idea that the weapons systems Earth strategists had spent 2 decades developing had never appeared in any document the Council had ever accessed. They had no idea that the alloys, the AI systems, the tactical frameworks they had accused humanity of building illegally were not the dangerous thing. The dangerous thing was that humans had been studying war since before any of them had left their home systems. Not the Council's wars, not the formal, codified fleet engagements that 9,000 years of interspecies diplomacy had turned into something resembling procedure. Human wars. The grinding, total, inventive, ugly kind. The kind that changed shape whenever they had to. The kind that had never once, in 4,000 years of recorded history, produced a species that simply stopped. The Council had looked at that history and seen barbarism. They had not understood that what they were looking at was an education. The silence lasted 39 hours. Then the second door opened. What hell learned from history. The order came through at 0420, and Commander Dax Ivara was already awake. She had not slept in 22 hours, not from anxiety, but because something about this particular kind of command replaced exhaustion with a very clean, very cold focus that made sleep feel beside the point. She commanded Strike Group Meridian, 8 ships, operating under Verity Phase 3, assigned the first coordinated infrastructure action in human history against a superior multi-species military coalition. She wants to be precise about what that means, not what it sounds like, what it actually was. They did not go after warships. They did not chase the Council's enforcement fleet into direct engagement. Their planners had spent years running simulations, cross-referencing historical analyses, and rebuilding conflict models from scratch. And the answer they kept arriving at, consistently, across every test scenario, was the same. Don't fight the weapon. Take away everything that makes the weapon work. The Council's enforcement fleet needed fuel. It needed replacement components. It needed nutritional supply for 19 different biological profiles. It needed the relay stations that carried command signals across 8 star systems. It needed the automated cargo depots that kept its ships operational between rotations. The fleet was powerful, but power in deep space is not an intrinsic property. It is a supply chain problem. Cut enough of the chain and the power goes away, not in one dramatic moment, but incrementally and irreversibly. In 41 hours of observation during the silence, Earth's intelligence teams mapped every critical node in that chain within operational range. 37 targets. Fuel platforms, relay nodes, deep space cargo depots staffed with skeleton crews of civilian technicians. No military garrisons, no weapons emplantments. The Council had not fortified its supply network because no one had ever attacked it. The concept simply had no category in their doctrine. Dax's rules of engagement were precise. Every installation with a non-military crew was to receive a mandatory evacuation signal 30 minutes before engagement. The teams were not there to harm workers. They were there to dismantle Reach. She gave each evacuation order personally. At 0500, Strike Group Meridian moved. The first target was Aurea Station 7, positioned at a junction point where 4 supply routes intersected. Large, effectively unmanned, enough fuel to sustain 40 warships for 5 months. They came in from below the orbital plane.
This detail matters. The Council's sensor architecture had been designed by engineers who made a foundational assumption. No vessel running an offensive operation would sacrifice the fuel efficiency required to approach from below the ecliptic. The energy cost was significant. It was, from within their doctrinal framework, wasteful. Earth's engineers had found this assumption inside a signals intelligence packet assembled over 9 years of careful passive observation. They had noted it. They had factored the additional fuel cost into every loadout calculation from the beginning of Phase 3 planning. The approach vector was not a discovery. It was a prepared exploit, waiting for the moment they needed it. Aurea Station 7 appeared on the forward display, and it looked exactly as the intelligence photographs had shown it. A broad octagonal frame structure, white against the dark, 6 extended arms loaded with storage cylinders. No defense screen, no patrol, no reason to have either. Dax's weapons officer, a precise and quiet man named Sev Harlow, confirmed target lock. She said, "Execute." He said, "Executing." The strike lasted 9 seconds. Aurea Station 7 ceased to function as an installation in the time it takes to draw a slow breath. Meridian was already turning onto the next approach vector before the debris field had expanded to its full extent. 5 more targets fell in the next 4 hours. The group moved through the sector like something the Council's doctrine had no word for, because their entire military framework had no category for it. Their enforcement commanders were watching for fleet engagements. They were waiting for human warships to form up and trade fire the way that 9,000 years of codified interspecies conflict said military forces were supposed to behave. Instead, they got something that hit infrastructure and was gone before a response force could establish coordinates. Meridian's hull coatings had been derived from deep ocean stealth research, a field of study that was, on its surface, entirely civilian and entirely unrelated to space warfare. The coatings reduced sensor cross-section to background noise levels at distances above 45,000 kilometers. The decoy drones running ahead of the group were broadcasting false fleet signatures 60 light seconds away, drawing Council response ships toward empty space while the actual strikes were completed and the group was already in transit to the next target. Their communications officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Leon Voss, intercepted a Council command transmission at 0714. Scrambled. She broke the encryption in less than 5 minutes using keys assembled from an 8-year signals intelligence operation, decoded it, and read it aloud to the bridge. The Delvari fleet commander was reporting to the Council's Joint Operations Center. His transmission stated that human vessels had struck 6 infrastructure targets in a single operational window. No prior warning, no pattern consistent with any known tactical doctrine in Council strategic archives.
Response forces had reached the strike coordinates and found wreckage in cold space. The attacking vessels had left no sensor trace. Then he used a phrase that Leon translated carefully, pausing over it. The Delvari word had no clean equivalent in human standard. The closest rendering, she said, was something like a thing that decided to stop waiting. Dax thought that was fairly accurate. But then came the moment she had not planned for. Approaching Target 7, a relay node at the edge of the sector, Leon called a proximity alert. 2 Council ships, a Cyrith patrol cruiser, and a Delvari escort, not responding to the strikes. They had been repositioned by their command as a general precautionary measure and had stumbled across Meridian's approach vector by geometry, not intelligence. They were faster than they needed to be. Dax ran the calculation in 3 seconds. Breaking clear would burn the fuel reserve they needed for extraction. Evasive routing would expose the group's position to wider sensor coverage. Or they could engage. She looked at Sev. He looked back. She said, "Defensive posture. We protect the group. We do not pursue." The engagement lasted 7 minutes and 12 seconds. She will not describe it as anything other than what it was, loud and fast, and requiring every person on her bridge to operate at the edge of their capability. The shields on the second vessel in her group, the CPF Stonewall, dropped to 22% before enough distance was created. A long-range round from Meridian's forward battery found the Cyrith cruiser's propulsion assembly. The Delvari escort pulled back to cover its partner. Meridian broke contact and ran.
When it was over and she had a moment to breathe, she turned to give the next navigation order. The station to her left was empty. Her first officer had been named Kael Maren. She had served with him since before the constant Meridian deployment. He was 41 years old. He had a younger brother who grew up to become a botanist in one of the outer settlements and who sent him pressed plant samples in the post because Kaz had always, improbably, loved flowers. He used to keep a small dried one tucked inside the cover of his operational manual, where regulations technically did not permit personal items. The strike that took his station was clean and very fast. He had not had time to say anything. Dax stood at his station for 5 seconds. She logged his name and the time in the mission record. Then she moved to the command chair and gave the next order. What she held on to through everything that followed was the thing she had known from the beginning and had not stopped knowing even for a moment during the engagement. This was not what humanity wanted. They had not come to the stars looking for this. They had come looking for what every colony ship and every trade route and every ambassador stationed in a room built for everyone except them represented: a future with more room in it, more possibility, more of the things a species reaches for when it is done fighting to survive and ready to start building something that lasts. They had wanted to belong to the galaxy. The galaxy had made that impossible. And so they were doing the only other thing humans had ever been genuinely exceptional at. They were making the cost of opposing them too high to sustain. By the end of the operational window, 27 of the 37 targets had been neutralized across 5 strike groups operating in parallel across the sector. The Council's command network was flooding with reports. The reports all said the same thing in 49 different languages. This is not how they were supposed to fight.
Dax transmitted her status report to Fleet Command. Then she sat in the quiet of her breach and looked at Kael Maren's empty station and thought about what was being built here, in this dark, in this silence between stars. They were sending a message, written in the only language the Council had left them with, and it was being received. My name is Veth Counselor San Auris. I served as Senior Strategic Advisor to the Cyrath Continuance Directorate for 26 years. What I am about to say was submitted as formal testimony to the Galactic Council's Post-Conflict Review Commission and translated into human standard English at the personal request of Ambassador Kael Maren, who asked that it be preserved in the public record of these events. I will begin with what we believed at the time. The Galactic Council had existed in its current form for 9,200 years when Resolution 7 Vendra was passed. In that period, we had admitted 28 species as full members and 11 as provisional observers. Of all them, humanity was the most recently admitted, the most rapidly expanding, and the most extensively discussed in internal security assessments. I will not pretend otherwise. We had records on human civilization dating back 58 years before first contact, from the moment we first detected their electromagnetic emissions. We had monitored their development with what I can only describe in retrospect as anxious fascination.
The reason for our anxiety was their history. Every species that has joined this council arrived at space having already resolved, at least functionally, the patterns of conflict that characterized their early development. The Delvari had their Convergence Compact. The Oraki had their Long Settlement. My own people, the Sirath, had the Founding Peace, which ended the last significant armed conflict in our home system approximately 3,800 years ago. By the time any of us reached the stars, organized warfare was a historical category. We understood it academically. We kept records of it. It was behind us. Humanity was different. Humanity had been in conflict, internally, creatively, and with extraordinary persistence for the entirety of its recorded existence. They had fought with hand weapons, and then with mechanized systems, and then with technologies capable of affecting entire populations across continental distances. They had fought over land, over resources, over ideas, over wounds both real and generations old. They had fought wars that lasted a single afternoon, and wars whose effects shaped their civilization for centuries. They had fought wars that unmade everything they had built. And then, and this was the part none of us had truly processed until it was far too late, they rebuilt. Not simply in the physical sense, though they accomplished that with a speed that other species found extraordinary. They rebuilt institutionally. They examined the failure. They identified what had collapsed and why. They restructured their systems, political, legal, social, military, specifically to prevent the same failure from occurring the same way twice. Their entire civilizational architecture was the accumulated product of a species that had made every catastrophic mistake available to it, and had survived each one, and then asked consistently how to do better next time. We looked at this history, and we saw a species that had not yet grown beyond its violent period.
We did not understand that what we were looking at was the most comprehensively stress-tested civilization in the known galaxy. When Resolution 7 Vendra passed, our military planners estimated that human response capability would be limited to isolated retaliatory actions on border installations. They estimated that within 45 days, the economic pressure of the quarantine would force a negotiated settlement on terms favorable to the Council. These projections were prepared by the most experienced analysts we had, using the most sophisticated modeling systems available. I can tell you now that every assumption in those projections was wrong. Not wrong in the way that intelligence estimates are sometimes slightly miscalibrated. Wrong in the way that a person is wrong when they attempt to predict the behavior of something they have fundamentally misunderstood at the level of first principles. The first thing that caught us off guard was the silence itself. When our enforcement fleets moved in and human space went dark, our commanders interpreted it as compliance, as surrender. The concept of strategic deception at this scale, conducted as a deliberate operational phase with a pre-calculated activation trigger, did not exist in our tactical doctrine. Our analysts reviewed the silence afterward and found that it had lasted exactly as long as human planning models required for Phase 3 preparation. Not approximately, exactly. Every hour of it had been intentional. The second thing was the targeting. We expected, if there was any response at all, that it would come at our warships. That is where military responses come in every conflict in our recorded history. You strike the weapons, you engage the fleet, you contest territory through direct confrontation. This is what war looks like. This is what it has always looked like in 9,000 years of interspecies engagement. They hit our supply network. My fleet commander at the Keln Enforcement Corridor reported to me personally after the first operational window. He was not dramatic man. He had served in 2 previous Council enforcement actions. He was calm, experienced, and careful with language. When I asked him to describe what had happened, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "They removed our ability to sustain the engagement without ever engaging us directly. They did not fight the war we were prepared for. They took away the ground the war would have been fought on." I recorded that statement verbatim in my personal log. The third thing was the speed at which they adapted. By the time our forces identified a countermeasure to the approach vector pattern used in the first operational wave, the human groups had already shifted to 3 alternate profiles that the countermeasure did not address. Our analysts required an average of 7 hours to identify each new pattern. The human groups were operating on a rotation cycle of 4 hours and 15 minutes. We were always behind. I brought this to the Joint Security Committee 11 days into the operation. I said we had a fundamental problem. I said our projections had been built on a model of human military behavior that did not match the human military behavior we were observing. I said we needed to revisit our assumptions, and we needed to do it immediately. The committee asked me what alternative model I was proposing. I said I did not have one yet.
I said I had been reading available human historical texts for 6 days straight, and I had not found a conflict in their history that resembled what they were doing to us, because in their own past they had only ever operated this way when they were the ones under pressure. When they were the ones outgunned and outnumbered, facing a larger adversary with greater resources. when they were the ones who had to be creative because conventional engagement would lose. They had fought this way, with deception, with patience, with strikes at infrastructure, with an ability to absorb loss without fracturing, and I could not find a point in their history where it had ultimately failed them. The committee was not ready to hear that. It took 14 more days and the loss of 5 enforcement vessels, not in fleet engagements, but to what our damage assessors could only describe as extraordinarily precise ambush operations, before the committee agreed to formally review its position. The ceasefire proposal came from the Iraqi delegation. They drafted a document proposing a return to pre-resolution status with a joint review commission to address the original grievances. Measured, reasonable. They transmitted it through the one open diplomatic channel Ambassador Maren had maintained active throughout. We waited for a response. When it came back, it was not a counter-proposal. It was a list, a complete, precisely structured, legally formatted list of terms. It referenced specific clauses of the Maren Compact by article number. It cited council precedents going back 360 years. It used our own legal architecture against us with a fluency that indicated preparation not of days or weeks, but of years. The terms included formal recognition of human sovereign space with defined and permanently protected boundaries. Council acknowledgement, formal and recorded, that Resolution 7 Vendra had been applied illegally against a civilian vessel. Restorative compensation to the families of those lost on the ardent shore, to be paid by the member states who voted and authorized enforcement. Permanent human seats on the Council's Security Review Body and Legal Oversight Commission, and a new foundational clause to be inserted into the Maren Compact itself, which they called Article 0, prohibiting any preemptive enforcement action against a member species without unanimous vote and a mandatory 60-day diplomatic review period. The last item on the list was this: the names of all 6,412 individuals aboard the Ardent Shore were to be recorded permanently in the preamble of the amended compact, as a standing, irremovable acknowledgement of what the Council's failure had cost. The committee read the list in silence. One of my colleagues asked how long humanity had been preparing this document. I said, I believe they prepared it before the first strike, before the silence, possibly before the vote. They prepared their military response and their legal resolution simultaneously, because they do not separate the fighting from the peace. They plan for both at once. No one spoke for a moment. Then I said the thing I had been working toward for 3 weeks of sleepless nights reading human history. I said, we made a mistake we cannot afford to repeat. We looked at a species that had suffered more than any civilization in this Council's history, that had endured, rebuilt, and adapted across 4,000 years of recorded conflict, and we decided they were dangerous because of their capacity for violence. We never asked what that violence had cost them. We never asked what it had taught them. We treated their history as a warning about what they were. We never once considered what it had made them into. No one at the table disagreed. The vote to accept humanity's terms passed 46 in favor, 1 abstention.
Ambassador Maren received the notification in his quarters on Virith Anchor, where he had stayed for the entire duration of the conflict. He had not left. He had kept that one diplomatic channel open every day in case someone on the other side wanted to use it. Someone finally had. His aide, Petra Sol, told him afterward that he had read the confirmation message twice before saying anything. Then he had opened his personal log and written one line. She does not know what it said. He has never shared it.
Kael Maren returned to the Resonance Hall 6 weeks after the ceasefire. The chamber looked the same. The pale bioluminescent panels along the upper tiers, the concentric seating rings designed for 49 species and their environmental requirements, the acoustic dampening tuned to a hearing range that gave humans a low-grade headache after 3 hours. He took his headache tablet before entering. Old habit. The session was unusual. No formal resolution on the agenda, no vote scheduled. The Council had agreed, as part of the settlement, to a full recorded reading of the amended Maren Compact Preamble, the new version, with the names. Every delegation was present. Some had come specifically to observe. Several species who were not Council members had sent observers of their own. Kael sat in the Earth seat. To his right, Petra Sol. To his left, 2 newly designated human representatives to the Security Review Body, both of whom were sitting in Council chambers for the first time in their lives. They were composed and professional, and he could tell they were quietly overwhelmed. He remembered feeling that way himself 7 years ago, walking into this room and understanding for the first time just how thoroughly it had been built for everyone except his species. He did not tell them it got easier. He told them it got different, which was closer to true. Counselor Veth Aran opened the session. She moved to the reading podium with her characteristic slowness, the slowness of something that had existed long enough to understand which moments deserved unhurried attention. She activated the translation field. She opened the document. The new preamble began with the original language of the compact, 900 years of interspecies legal architecture, the formal acknowledgement of shared civilization, the commitments to mutual recognition and non-aggression that every member species had ratified. Kael had read it many times. He knew it almost by memory. Then came the new section. Veth Aran read it without inflection, in the measured cadence of formal recitation. The translation chip against Kael's ear converted it into human standard, and the words arrived with the slight lag that always accompanied translation across languages that had evolved on completely different biological substrates. The Council, it said, recognized its failure, not abstractly, not in the vague diplomatic language of institutional regret, specifically. The vote, the enforcement action, the ardent shore, the 5 minutes between the conclusion of the vote and the movement of the enforcement fleet into the Keln corridor. Then the names began. All 6,412,000 of them. Veth Aran read every one. It took 4 hours and 17 minutes. The chamber was completely silent for all of it. No delegate moved to leave. No aide whispered to a superior. The environmental systems cycled and maintained the 53 different atmospheric conditions required to keep 49 species alive in the same room, and nobody in that room made a sound while the names of the dead were spoken into the record.
Kael listened to every name.
He thought about the things he knew now that he had not known when he first walked into this chamber 7 years ago. He knew that the diplomatic corps had been given, at the same time he was first briefed on his assignment, a classified operational file he was never shown, the early development framework for what would eventually become contingency verity. He had not known it existed during any of his 7 years of patient, measured, rule-following diplomacy. He had not known that while he was sitting in this chamber, learning how to smile at species that did not have mouths, engineers and strategists and historians on the other side of human space were building a response to the scenario he had just lived through. He was not sure, even now, how he felt about that. He knew that the humans who had carried out Phase 3 had not wanted to. He knew from the mission logs he had been given access to as part of his role preparing the legal resolution that the strike group commanders had given every evacuation signal themselves, personally, and that several of them had delayed strikes by minutes to confirm that evacuation was complete before weapons were engaged. He knew that the conflict had cost lives on the human side, names that were not in the preamble, but that were in other records, other logs, the kind that didn't get read in chambers, but were carried by the people who survived them. He knew that Kael Maren had liked flowers. He knew that the legal team that had drafted humanity's response terms had begun working on the document 3 days before the vote, not because they had anticipated losing the vote, but because they had anticipated that the vote, whichever way it went, would be the beginning of something, and they had decided to know where it ended before it started. He had read Veth Counselor San Oris's testimony twice in preparation for the settlement negotiations. He had read the part about what the Council had looked at when they looked at human history, and what they had failed to understand about what they were seeing. He did not feel vindicated by it. That was not the right word. He felt the way a person feels after a very long and very costly proof of something they already knew, a proof that had been necessary only because nobody else would take their word for it. When the last name was read, Veth Aran closed the document and stood in silence for a moment. Then she said, in the formal closing of a Sirath recitation, the phrase that translated roughly as, "The record is complete and the record is permanent." The chamber remained silent for a long time afterward. Then, one by one, the delegations began to stand. Not in unison, not ceremonially, just standing. The Delvari delegation, then the Oraki, then several others. Species with no hands raised the equivalents of them. Species that communicated through bioluminescence shifted to the frequency their cultural tradition associated with acknowledgement. Not applause, not celebration, something older and more deliberate than either. Kael remained seated. Petra, beside him, said quietly, "They're standing." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you going to?" Kael Maren returned to the resonance hall 6 weeks after the ceasefire. The chamber looked the same. The pale bioluminescent panels along the upper tiers, the concentric seating rings designed for 49 species and their environmental requirements, the acoustic dampening tuned to a hearing range that gave humans a low-grade headache after 3 hours. He took his headache tablet before entering. Old habit. The session was unusual. No formal resolution on the agenda, no vote scheduled.
The Council had agreed, as part of the settlement, to a full recorded reading of the amended Maren Compact Preamble, the new version, with the names. Every delegation was present. Some had come specifically to observe. Several species who were not Council members had sent observers of their own. Kael sat in the Earth seat. To his right, Reva Stahl. To his left, two newly designated human representatives to the security review body, both of whom were sitting in council chambers for the first time in their lives. They were composed and professional, and he could tell they were quietly overwhelmed. He remembered feeling that way himself 7 years ago, walking into this room and understanding for the first time just how thoroughly it had been built for everyone except his species. He did not tell them it got easier. He told them it got different, which was closer to true. Counselor Reva Stahl opened the session. She moved to the reading podium with her characteristic slowness, the slowness of something that had existed long enough to understand which moments deserved unhurried attention. She activated the translation field. She opened the document. The new preamble began with the original language of the compact, 900 years of interspecies legal architecture, the formal acknowledgement of shared civilization, the commitments to mutual recognition and non-aggression that every member species had ratified. Kael had read it many times. He knew it almost by memory. Then came the new section. Reva Stahl read it without inflection, in the measured cadence of formal recitation. The translation chip against Kael's ear converted it into human standard, and the words arrived with the slight lag that always accompanied translation across languages that had evolved on completely different biological substrates. The Council, it said, recognized its failure, not abstractly, not in the vague diplomatic language of institutional regret, specifically. The vote, the enforcement action, the ardent shore, the 5 minutes between the conclusion of the vote and the movement of the enforcement fleet into the Keln corridor. Then the names began. All 6,412,000 of them. Reva Stahl read every one. It took 4 hours and 17 minutes. The chamber was completely silent for all of it. No delegate moved to leave. No aide whispered to a superior. The environmental systems cycled and maintained the 53 different atmospheric conditions required to keep 49 species alive in the same room, and nobody in that room made a sound while the names of the dead were spoken into the record. Kael listened to every name.